Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I present these videos normally on a weekly basis for a twofold purpose. First off, to help move my brain out of percolation mode, as I call it, into sermonation mode as I seek to prepare the sermon that I will proclaim or preach to my congregation on Sundays. And this is based on the Revised Common Lectionary. Itself is a organizational tool used to bring Scripture into usable passages for worship purposes on a 3-year cycle. The second reason for producing these videos is just to allow you, the viewer who has stumbled across this video for whatever reason, whether you were looking for it or whether you're a normal viewer or if you're brand new, to just allow you to gain a different perspective and some different insight into the assigned text for that particular week. Now, as I mentioned, I normally do these weekly. This is a special episode. This one is in preparation for Maundy Thursday. Now, here we are during Holy Week. So I've got this one going on, and I will be preaching during special worship for Maundy Thursday. There's also Good Friday that features its own long gospel text. I will not be preaching on that one, so I won't be doing a video for that one. But and then in addition, I'll do my normal video later on in the week for this coming Sunday, which itself will be Easter Sunday. But coming back around to Maundy Thursday, the 3-year lectionary cycle actually presents the same gospel text each year. So every year this is our same gospel lesson. Now this particular week happens to, or this date, I should say, is April 2nd, 2015. That is Maundy Thursday. And the gospel text for that comes out of John's gospel, and it's John chapter 13, verses 1 through 13a, and then, 1 through 12a, and then 31b through 35. So, speaking more large term, this is the story of the Last Supper from John's gospel. And it's got some differences from the other 3 gospels, or the synoptic gospels as they're called. One here in John's gospel happened a day sooner. Those ones, it happens, the Last Supper is the Passover meal. Here in John, it's the day before the Passover meal, and so Jesus is killed on the day of preparation. So he is killed the same time that the lambs are slaughtered, indicating that he is the great Passover sacrifice, or the final Passover sacrifice. But I'm getting ahead of myself there. Some other differences is just the overall length. Here in John's gospel, the Last Supper, or the setting of the Last Supper, takes about 4 chapters. It starts here in chapter 13 and goes all the way through chapter 17 before it's finally finished, and then in 18 then the narrative continues. But what's going on in the context of this, oftentimes when we think about the Last Supper, we think communion, and well, we should. The other 3 Gospels all present that to where Jesus instituted for the first time Eucharist, or communion, whatever you want to call it. That's not present here, other than one tiny little snippet that's kind of in the midst of the overarching passage. So that's one major difference. But also we just kind of hear about some other things. Now, something else that happens during this that does not happen in the other Gospels is when Jesus washes his disciples' feet, and that is really the featured portion of this particular text for this setting of Maundy Thursday. Going into it, chapter 13, verse 1. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. That's a theme throughout John's gospel, is my hour has not yet come, my time has not yet come. And we hear that several times throughout the course of the narrative. Well, now it has. This is what Jesus came to do. This is why Jesus came into the world. This is why God took on flesh and dwelled among us, to eventually die, to come to this moment. It was intentional. And we see that throughout all of John's gospel, that Jesus is always very intentional about what's going on. It's always moving towards something. Well, this is it. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. This is kind of, it almost initially seems like a little bit of a throwaway comment, but why would we hear this? We focus more on Judas in a little bit, actually, in that gap that lies between the listed reading. So why is it in here? And perhaps it's just a reminder that, hey, evil was present at this, and Jesus knowingly went into it. Or it could also be the notion that of everything that's going on, Judas was present, at least for this first portion, and the foot washing, what Jesus does for his followers, for those that he loves, what he's doing for all humankind is offered to all humankind, regardless of the presence of evil and darkness within our lives. Could be what that's there for, but moving on. So, and during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. Now, some background on this. In Jesus' day and age, people walked everywhere, as did livestock, so your feet were always going to get dirty, dusty from the road, maybe smelly if you happen to step in a little surprise from the animals. But because of this, it was very common when you would come into someone's home, out of general hospitality, they would provide for your feet to be washed, for you to clean your feet as you're coming in. Now, the water would be provided in the basin, and either you would do it yourself, which was a possibility, or a servant would do it for you. The master of the house would not do it. He would not lower himself to do that. And you would not do it for your equal, but and also in the case of Jesus, being the rabbi, being the teacher, he certainly would not do it for his disciples within that day and age. And yet this is exactly what he does. He takes on the role of the servant or the slave. It's really a slave's duty to do this in the household. So Jesus is showing his love for those he cares about by serving them, by willingly taking on this role of servant. So that's kind of what's going on there. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean, and you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason, he said, "Not all of you are clean." Okay, so we get this little exchange in the midst of this between Jesus and Peter. Jesus is washing the feet of the disciples, and Peter clearly doesn't get it. And Peter's kind of always the spokesman, not always, but most of the time is the spokesman for the disciples. He's kind of the one who says what they all seem to be thinking. And he doesn't get it. And Jesus acknowledges that. Now you do not understand what I'm doing, but you will. We need to remember that even though we know the story and we know where this goes and we know that this ends in the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, the disciples didn't know that. They're experiencing this in real time. These are real people experiencing this without the benefit of hindsight. And so, no, they don't get what's going on. They don't understand that Jesus is showing his devotion not only to them as individuals, but to all of humanity. Now, Peter kind of goes back and forth a little bit. And what's interesting to note here, as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the Last Supper, that setting is connected with communion, or at least the sacramental aspect. And here in John's Gospel, we got to try pretty hard to get there. And it's just kind of one little snippet that I'll talk about in a bit. But here is kind of another little snippet that we could connect back to baptism if we try hard. Peter says when he finally realizes, hey, Jesus is going to wash my feet whether I like it or not, he says, don't just wash my feet, but wash my hands and my head as well. And to me, as I read that and I think about that, it seems like he's saying, wash all of me. Make me clean. Wash all of me. And it's very reminiscent of how they would have performed baptism at that time. And still some denominations will do it the same way even today with what they call full immersion. And in Jesus' time, it would have been at a lake or a river or whatever, and the Jordan River, for example, and they dunked the person, full immersion under the water, washing all of them to wash away their uncleanness, and so that they are purified. Well, so is this what Peter is saying here? And I think perhaps, we don't know exactly, but we could make that connection if we wanted to. But the interesting thing about it is Jesus says to him, one who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, for they are clean. They are entirely clean, and I say that you are clean. And to me, this speaks to the promise that we are given in baptism, that in the waters of our baptism, we are washed clean and we are a new creation. That old sinful self that feels the power of sin and death in our lives is gone. So there is that little connection there. Okay, after he had washed their feet, he put on his robe and returned to the table. And he said, now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify in himself and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Now, this is speaking to what Jesus had done in the foot washing. Now, the foot washing's over, and we've seen a gap, and in that gap, he confronts Judas about the eventual betrayal. And again, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But so now we hear that the hour has come, and God is going to be glorified in it. Again, this is why Jesus came. This is why God took on flesh to dwell among us, because he needed eventually to die. And in that death, God is glorified, because God is reestablishing the relationship, making it possible between humanity and God yet again. Now, an interesting little side note, as Jesus says here, where I am going, as I told the Jews before, you cannot come. This one catches my attention because it seems to indicate death. Again, remember, the disciples don't know where this is going. We do, but it seems to be talking about death. And perhaps this is prevalent in my mind because within my congregation during this past week, we had a pretty prominent death. So this notion that death creates a barrier, death creates a separation that we cannot cross, where we cannot interact with one another across that barrier. We cannot connect across that barrier. That notion is just still pretty strong in my mind at this time. And so that's perhaps why this catches my attention. But we know now in hindsight that Jesus will die, and that in his resurrection, he comes back as something new. This isn't just him raising someone from the dead, as we've seen in a few different examples throughout the gospel lessons or the gospels, but that he is resurrected into new life, and that one day we will share that, but not yet. And so that's kind of something that's going on there. But then we hear also, I give you a new commandment to love one another. And this speaks to what Jesus views as the most important of commandment, which is love God and then love your neighbor as yourself. How do you know? I give you a new command to love one another, act out of love. So that's all that's going on. Now, as I said, I want to back up. We've got this gap from verses 12 through 30. And there's interesting stuff that's happened. First off, Jesus talks just a little bit more about the whole foot washing thing and what he's doing. And that he's talking about, be a servant. As I have served you, so you must serve one another. And it really kind of comes down to that whole loving one another thing. But that's going on. And then he goes on and he talks some more about the betrayal that's coming. We hear Jesus is troubled in spirit and declares, very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. Now the disciples don't know who he's talking about. We wonder even if Judas knows what he's talking about. We did hear at the beginning in verse 2, the devil had put it upon his heart for Judas to betray him. And there's an ambiguity in the Greek of did Satan put it in Judas's heart to betray Jesus, or did Satan decide in his own heart that Judas would be the one to betray Jesus? We don't exactly know, and perhaps that's kind of semantics and not really that important, but we hear and said that, and so the disciples are trying to figure out, okay, Jesus said somebody's going to betray him. Who's it going to be? And they're trying to find out. And Jesus says, the one that I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. So he dipped the piece of bread, gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Interesting. Jesus said, do quickly what you are going to do. No one at the table knew why he said this. They thought perhaps because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him buy what we needed for the festival, or that he should give something to the poor. But after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So we hear this little passage about Judas. And if you recall, I said a little bit ago that there's this tiny little glimmer that something that could potentially be communion here in this portion, and it's that. The one that I give the piece of bread to that I've dipped. Well, dipped in what? Probably wine. That would have been what they were drinking. So he takes a loaf of bread, he breaks it. He takes a piece of bread ripped off of the loaf, dips it in the wine, and gives it to Judas. Well, that sounds an awful lot like communion, but again, this is a stretch. It's perhaps implied, and we can maybe make that connection, but it's interesting that the one who seems to get quote unquote communion here is Judas, and his feet were also washed. And as we hear about them being washed, and we think that baptismal thing, all of this is still offered to Judas, even though the presence of evil is there within him. And I think this is where I'm going to go with the sermon, at least at this point, is that though there is the presence of evil in our lives, and though we still feel the presence of sin, and we still feel the presence of death in our lives, we know that we are made that new creation through baptism, and that through the body and blood we are broken for you, given for you. We are granted forgiveness of sins. So they call them the means of grace there in the notion of the two sacraments. So I think that's where I'm going to go. But again, that remains to be seen. I hope you found this helpful as we explore this passage. Again, this passage comes up every year, and so we continue to revisit it year after year after year. But that's okay, because obviously there's a lot going on in this. If you have any thoughts or questions or comments or insights of your own, please pop them down into the comment section. I'd love to hear from you when those comments show up, and we can continue the conversation and learn from one another. That's always important that we do that. So otherwise, I hope that God is with you during this Holy Week, which it can be both very wonderful and very bright and awesome, and also very dark and difficult to walk at the same time. So I hope God is with you during this. And remember, Easter is Super Bowl when we win. So have a great week. God bless.